As the disastrous oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico continues to gush crude into the waters off America's east coast at a rate of up to 60,000 barrels of oil a day, the Australian government has now been handed its own hot potato. The Federal Resources Minister Martin Ferguson has received a much-anticipated report by the Commission of Inquiry into the 2-month oil leak and fire last year at the Montara exploration well in the Timor Sea off northwestern Australia's Kimberley coast. The Australian oil industry is on tenterhooks awaiting the findings of the inquiry, as are environmentalists, who've called on the Minister to release this report immediately. That won't happen until Martin Ferguson has decided how the government should respond to recommendations, given the acute sensitivities about the future of the Australian oil industry and the many who are dependent on it. Business editor Greg Hoy reports.
The Deepwater Horizon tragedy in the Gulf of Mexico opened a putrid wound 1,500 metres below sea level that's infected not only the marine environment, but the modus operandi of the world's oil industry.
It has highlighted the risks of drilling at great depths, where if we do have an accident, we don't have the technology to fix the problem.
The crude leaking profusely now for 2 months, reminiscent of Australia's Montara oil and gas leak late last year, also lasting 2 months, though it was a distant 250 kilometres off the Kimberley coast of northwestern Australia.
There was definitely an attitude of out of sight, out of mind.
The Montara rig's Thai operator estimated 5,000 tonnes of oil were lost. Many believe it was far more, before emergency crews plugged the leak by drilling a relief well, as is now being attempted in the Gulf of Mexico.
The US authorities have been in contact with my own department and I might say the Australian Maritime Safety Authority.
Australian industry representatives and experts have been called on by the US government to assist in the operation to bring the well back under control.
But America's oil disaster has fueled great anxiety over a report recently handed to the Australian Resources Minister by the Commission of Inquiry into the oil leak at Montara, which is under the regulatory supervision of the Northern Territory.
We've been very anxious to see what's in the Montara Commission of Inquiry report as quickly as we can so that we can get a good understanding of what happened with this incident, what went wrong with this incident, and ensure that we minimise the chance of this incident occurring again.
My first priority was to actually work with industry to actually get the well plugged and put the fire out. But it was always understood that as soon as we attended to those priorities, we would get on with a no-blame inquiry into the cause of the incident so we could learn from it.
Not everyone was so enamoured with the no-blame inquiry. The Centre for Marine Futures at the University of Western Australia has recorded 12,000 hours of footage to monitor offshore marine life, but laments the level of marine monitoring by relevant authorities at the far distant Montara oil spill.
It just astounds me that we can have an accident of the scale of Montara and not be looking at the environmental impacts carefully.
The Centre's Professor Jessica Meerwig has closely monitored developments in the Montara Commission of Inquiry.
It does appear that there were significant problems with the operators in terms of how they conducted their business, and there seems to be significant concern that they didn't have multiple seals in place when they suspended the well. There's also been significant questions about the degree to which the NT government audited and inspected the wells to make sure that things had been appropriately tested.
Amidst evidence it was under-resourced, the Northern Territory's submission to the Commission denied regulatory failure contributed to Montara's failure. Though on the day he received the full Montara report, the Federal Resources Minister flagged reform is not only essential, it's imminent.
I actually think we should go down the path of a strong, single, national regulatory regime. That is agreed by industry to a large extent in principle, and it's agreed by all state and territory governments, with the exception of Western Australia. And I have undertaken to have further discussions with the West Australian Minister with respect to this issue following Montara.
Meantime, in the sea world surrounding Australia's coastline, the deepwater search and drilling for oil continues unabated, denoting a huge difference between the approach of the Australian government and the US administration.
President Obama had a moratorium and has called for an audit to assess the quality of the safety measures taken across other operations in the US, and we haven't had that sort of reaction in Australia.
We actually need a moratorium to sit back and consider oil and gas exploration in deep sea areas, in remote areas as a whole. We need to put in place marine sanctuaries, areas that are protected in total from oil and gas because they are simply too sensitive.
The moratorium declared on deepwater drilling in the US was successfully challenged in the courts, though the Obama administration says it will do everything to have it reinstated. The Australian Resources Minister, by contrast, opposes any such moratorium here, suggesting there's an overriding economic imperative for Australia.
At the moment it can only get worse because we're more and more required to import further petroleum products from overseas, and that's why the last thing we should do is just suspend production or exploration in Australia. Our responsibility is to actually ensure we meet our domestic requirements as best we can.
We don't think that a knee-jerk reaction like a moratorium will make us safer. What will make us safer as an industry is understanding what happened, how it happened in the Gulf of Mexico and at Montara.
And so, as the industry pushes into new frontiers, an environmental battle is looming, given that in expanding the search for oil, the government has recently released deep water acreage at great depths in promising or prospective areas like the Mentel Basin off Western Australia.
We do a lot of sampling down in that region. The proposed areas for drilling are much deeper than in the Gulf.
Spills do happen. These two have happened in the last year. In fact, there have been 8 significant spills internationally in the last 2 years.
I think in the last 25 years we've drilled about 1,500 wells in Australia. We've had one incident, that's Montara. But I also accept the view we've had one incident, and therefore we should learn from this instance.
The onus, the burden, the responsibility is on your shoulders.
Under political pressure in the US, BP says it's already spent $2 billion cleaning up its oil spill, the US government extracting a $20 billion compensation fund for ongoing costs. So what about Australia? We did ask the Resources and Environment Ministers, the oil company itself and the Industry Association how much the Australian oil spill has cost thus far. Sadly, there's been no answer. Clearly, there's a bigger priority driving Australian policy, namely the rising oil pressure.
The demand for transport fuel in Australia is going to keep increasing. Putting it in oil terms, as I say, our demand is about 300 million barrels a year now. In about